Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Straight Talk for Business. I have a very special guest with me today. So I'll start off with asking this question. Why do smart organizations with good people sometimes end up in scandals? This question has driven the research and teachings of my next guest for the last more than 20 years. Meet Guido Palazzo. Guido is a professor of business ethics at the Faculty of Business and Economics at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. He teaches and does research on the mechanisms of unethical decision making in organizations. Through his research, he has uncovered repeating patterns of behavior that have helped him develop insights into scandals that bad people rarely cause, but by good managers caught in dynamics they fail to see and understand. This is what really got my attention. By uncovering these repeating patterns, he helps organizations anticipate compliance risks and strengthen resilience. Guido has recently co-authored a book titled The Dark Pattern: The Hidden Dynamics of Corporate Scandals. It's a book that brings together 2 decades of research and teaching on the moral collapse of organizations. I read this book. In fact, I probably devoured this book. And before I even finished it, I knew that Guido would be the perfect guest to give us some straight talk about business and why things can go sideways when you least expect them to. Guido, welcome to Straight Talk.
Thanks for having me.
And I realize you are in Switzerland today and we have a bit of a time difference, but thank you so much for making your evening available to be here with me. I, as I said in the introduction, I read this book and I was quite riveted. And probably the reason is because you really dig into a couple of news headlines that were of particular interest to me. One was the Boeing fiasco, and let's face it, it was nothing short of a fiasco. And the other one was Wells Fargo. Actually, Volkswagen was right in there as well. So between Wells Fargo, Volkswagen, Boeing, could you tell us a little bit about what do you think are the two most likely dark patterns that you have come across when looking at scandals?
Maybe to start this conversation, the first thing I would highlight is a misunderstanding that we normally share when we look at corporate scandals. And it's this misunderstanding that we assume that bad things are done by bad people. So this famous bad apple theory. And if we just take out these few crooks, then everything is fine again. What we find, my co-author Ulrich Hofrage and I, in the book The Dark Pattern, when we analyze scandals, is something very different. It's the fact that many people on all levels of the organization can participate in wrongdoing in a way that their behavior mutually reinforces and pushes the company to the edge of what is legal and what is moral. So it's this idea that it's good people doing bad things that drives companies into problems, not bad people doing bad things. There might be bad people as well. There are always bad people. But just take the case of Wells Fargo, biggest American retail bank, in which more than 100,000 salespeople committed fraud on their own customers. 100,000. How do you explain this by looking at the character of people and say these are all bad people? That doesn't make sense. So what we found when we looked into that scandal and all the others is that it's the context. It's the situation in which people are when they make a decision. And that context can shift how they perceive reality, can shift how they perceive right and wrong, and transforms them into criminals. So that over time they lose the ability to see that what they do is wrong, like committing fraud on your own customers, and they just think this is acceptable, appropriate business behavior.
It's the
Now,
pressure. It's the pressure.
it's the pressure. It's what we call the dark pattern. So it's the result of, at least that's our argument in the book, of 9 different elements that together create that context. And if I would like to pick 3 key elements of this dark pattern, 3 building blocks, the first one is the leadership failure. It's toxic leadership. You have leaders at the top who create a climate of fear. Now you could say, well, these are the bad apples. Yes, there are some bad apples sometimes at the top. But what we look into the book is not the behavior of the CEOs, but of these salespeople at Wells Fargo in the middle, or these engineers at Boeing, at Volkswagen, somewhere in the middle. They are the ones who break the law, not the CEOs. The CEOs are the ones who design or co-design this context, right? So if you have toxic CEOs, and what you create is a climate of fear in which people do whatever it takes to survive because they have fear, right? They're yelled at, they're kicked out, they're humiliated. So these people do not see it as an option to say no when they're asked to do something. They already come to work with fear. So at the top of all these companies in the scandal, there are psychopaths, leaders who create this climate of fear. Now, and that's the first element of the dark pattern. Um, a second element, now imagine that you give those people who have fear, constant fear and desperation, you give them goals they cannot achieve. You give them this goal at Wells Fargo, for instance, to achieve a certain quota of sales per day. But these sales quota are so unrealistic that they cannot make it. But if you don't make it, your boss comes to you 4 times a day and yells at you in an open space office. Humiliates you, tells you if you don't achieve your goal, you can go and work for McDonald's, or don't dare to go home in the evening if you don't achieve those goals. There's this quote from one of these salespeople at Wells Fargo after the scandal erupted, who said, well, I've been fighting in the 1991 Iraq War, and I must admit that the climate or the situation at Wells Fargo was worse than the Iraq War. So now you can imagine the pressure on people. So you give them goals they cannot achieve. In a climate of fear when no one dares to speak up and say what you asked me to do is not possible, right? You have to find a solution. And if you see your colleagues doing the wrong thing, they falsify signatures of customers and they achieve their quota and they get promoted, they get their bonus, you just think, well, I get yelled at, they get promoted, I just do the same. And
It's
probably everyone does the same.
it's a little bit like dominoes, isn't it? When one
Yes.
falls and somebody sees this isn't so bad, then there's a line that falls in behind them.
We
Yeah,
are group animals, so we look around. What are the others doing in my context? What is the appropriate behavior in this organization? And if that behavior shifts towards illegality, we go with that shift, right? So because we see the others doing it and it feels normal.
yeah.
Take this case that we also discussed in the book of Lance Armstrong, the professional cyclist who won the Tour de France 7 times in a row. And we know he won it with the help of a drug called EPO that gave him 10% more performance. He always denied it, but when he could no longer deny it, because the evidence was overwhelming, he went to the Oprah show in the US TV and he said something interesting. He said, yes, I confess I used EPO, but I never cheated. I never cheated. Why did he not cheat in his own perspective? Well, because he saw all the other cyclists, his competitors, doing the same. And if they all do it, it's not cheating, right? It's
That's right.
creating a level playing field. So he was using a moral argument to rationalize away his cognitive dissonance about fraud. And this is what you find all the time. You find people who develop together a set of rules that applies to them that is totally illegal, immoral from the outside world's perspective, but inside the system, it all feels right. It feels normal because everyone is doing it. So this group pressure is another element in our story. This feeling of unfairness. So all the others cheat and I don't, so I cannot win, and that's not fair. I have the right to rebalance things in my favor. This is another element. And then to highlight one more in detail is what we call ambiguous rules. It's the ability of organizations to shift what people consider appropriate behavior. So think again
Mm.
about this situation at Wells Fargo. You observe the others committing fraud, and your superior tolerates this, promotes these people even, and you get the pressure, and you don't achieve your goals, and you are desperate in the evening. So you understand at one point that yes, I'm sent to a compliance training from time to time, and they tell me to follow the code of conduct. But then I observe them doing something else around me. And
Hmm.
that something else is not compatible with the code of conduct. So in the morning, they tell me, go to the left, follow the code. In the afternoon, they tell me, go to the right, bring me these contracts, these quota.
Yeah.
And I don't care how you do it. It's contradictory. And what you realize is that with these two types of rules, you have to make a choice, right? And this choice is normally the one that you see others taking around you. And what that creates is a gray zone, a gray zone in which everybody in the organization starts to interpret rules. How far can I go? And what kind of rule bending is tolerated? Who gets promoted despite breaking the compliance rule? So you have this gray zone in which, because of the fear, because of these goals you cannot achieve, because of this nagging feeling of unfairness, you're pushed to the limits. So, and you see, all these are reinforcing elements of what we call the dark pattern that repeat across all these scandals and pushes good people to do bad things.
So you mentioned at the beginning when you started talking about the examples that people at the top, maybe that's where the bad apples are. And that, sort of raises a whole raft of questions because do you think at the top where these issues happen, do you think that there's a conscious intention going on to push people to, because ultimately history has shown us that when you push way too much, people will do whatever it takes, legal or not. Or do you think that subconsciously some of these leaders are trying to make a cultural shift towards a different level of performance? Do you think it's conscious or subconscious is really the question I'm asking because ultimately the result is
Yeah,
always the same, right? You have a
I would say it's a mix. It's a
uh,
mix. And these people who become CEO or CFO and you create this terror regime around them, it's not that they turn evil once they have become top leaders. They have been socialized in an organizational world in which they were trained to believe that to be rough, to make pressure, to give these goals that are unrealistic, this is how you create performance in your teams, right?
mhm,
Or
mhm.
by just, as Jack Welch did, you pitch your own people against each other in a kind of a hunger game. So you tell them 20% will be fired at the end of the year. So it's this idea that performance results from brutal competition inside, from making pressure on people, from having a bit of fear. And you get some results with that. But it's like when you screw in a screw, you think you can do one more turn, but then it breaks. But you
And
don't
people break.
realize when it breaks. People break, yes.
Yeah,
You see these suicides, these burnouts, these turning good people into criminals. They break under this pressure.
yeah.
So I think that we promote the wrong people to the top. Um, we know from research that there's about 1% of people in society are psychopaths, but CEOs, it's 20%. Yeah, because if you are ruthless, if you are this risk taker, if you don't care about human beings, you go for the results, then you're considered a good manager. If you think twice, if you include your people in decisions, if you are a more yeah holistically thinking manager, you are perceived as weak. So you're not becoming the CEO. And if you want, if you're a CEO like this, you pull others like you to the top. So you create this dynamic in organizations that only these toxic people make it to the top. We have to do some soul searching.
Yeah. So the interesting thing is, when I was reading the book, so many scandals, came to mind that I was familiar with, and I started thinking about them. And of course, so many of these scandals are a total violation of any kind of regulation. And, we've got a couple going on right now in Canada, and I'm just wondering where they're going to end up. But, if I was a regulator and I'm reading your book and I'm thinking about, that there's 9 dark patterns that you talk about. And there's a there's a certain anatomy, I would say, in an organization where you're going to find a lot of these dark patterns. And because so many scandals result in the hands of regulators when it's time to review, would you say, if you were talking to a regulator, what would you advise them in terms of what to look for when they're looking at systemic risk? Because systemic is what has brought down, the Enrons, the Wells Fargo, and um, systemic for the organization. But some of these can go beyond, especially when I'm thinking the financial crisis,
Mhm.
albeit it's a long time ago, but people still remember, right? So what would you advise a regulator to be on the lookout for if they're looking for something that's very broad and spreads possibly across an entire industry, and not just one organization? Is there something?
But one of the elements of what we call the dark pattern is um, ideology. It's
Mm.
this belief that we are teaching in business school since decades that the only responsibility of a company is to increase profits, that markets are best regulated if they are not regulated at all, because any regulation is bad for efficiency. So, as Ronald Reagan said, governments are part of the problem, not the solution. We teach governments are bad, regulation is bad, free markets are the most efficient ones. Um, we teach that innovation is disruptive, you must smash stuff. So, this is ideology. Um, and if you look at the cases, what you see is that one of the reasons why these companies fail, why they are not um, remaining within the limits of the law and moral expectations, is that they are badly regulated. Think about Boeing. Boeing should have been regulated by the FAA, the association that the regulator for aviation. But they didn't have people, they didn't have resources because they were deregulated as an institution. So Boeing was self-certifying the 737 MAX. 97% of this new airplane was self-certified. So it's Boeing engineers checking the work of other Boeing engineers and sending a report to the regulator, FAA, that everything is fine.
Of course,
97%.
of course.
Volkswagen was doing its own emission tests because the regulator didn't have structures and procedures and people to do this. Theranos was not regulated at all. Um, Uber was entering the cities against all regulation for taxis, and no regulator was interfering. Right? So regulation failure is a key element of all these stories. We need a new thinking about what it means to regulate well, because yes, there might be over-regulation, there might be inefficiencies if regulators do the wrong job, but if they don't do their job at all, companies start to do whatever they want. And
And
that
get away
leads
and get away with
to
it.
airplanes crashing. To get away with it, crashing airplanes, um, whatever kind of harm they can do because they can. And I'm not so optimistic that this is changing in a good direction right now. I mean, the American authorities are even further destroying any kind of regulatory power they still have with Dodge and everything else, explicitly inviting companies to bribe abroad. So regulation has to be considered a key element of why things go wrong in companies.
Yeah. Guido, one of the things I learned a really long time ago, when I was going to law school, is language and the power of language. And of course, one of the dark patterns that you've highlighted is this manipulative language. And leaders are masters at it. In some, sometimes it's even deemed to be coercive, and many other words along that. And in presentations, in sales material, in even board meetings, public disclosures, all of these things, language is something that if you don't pay really, really close attention, can really dig a big hole. And I'm wondering, do you have a suggestion for what is a most effective way to draw attention to manipulative language? What advice would you give to someone on how to zoom in on it?
I think the biggest mistake that leaders in organizations make is to think that language is just a neutral tool to describe the world, right? But what it in reality is, it is a tool to create worlds, to create realities. The way a leader speaks and the leader thinks and acts is connected. And we can extend this and even argue that the way a leader speaks to their team will influence how that team perceives the world. The leader of Lehman Brothers, the CEO of Lehman Brothers, Richard Fuld, the only bank that went bankrupt in the financial crisis, he used to tell his people, cut the throat of your enemy. And he would give them plastic knives. And the enemy was not Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan. The enemy was your colleague next door, because at the end of the year, 20% of them would be fired. And so he created this internal war. And they were speaking, not just him, the whole organization had this warlike language. And if people are constantly talking as if they are in a war, it does something with them. Because in a war, rules don't count, right? Or the other rules that count. You are fighting to survive. So you have the right to do things that you wouldn't do if there would be peace. So war language, aggressive language is a very strong warning signal that something is going wrong or is potentially going wrong in an organization. There has been some research done by some colleagues who went to Glassdoor. Glassdoor is this website where you can leave anonymous comments on your company, right? So they looked into the data at Glassdoor, all these comments, and they were wondering if we take companies that had a scandal, and we compare, which you measure in fines they paid at a certain point in time, and you compare them with companies that had no scandal. Is there something we find in the language of the people who speak about their company on Glassdoor in the years before the scandal happened? Is there something changing? And the result was frightening. So, in companies that have a scandal, in the years before the scandal happened, the language changed. You find them, the employees, expressing all the things that we just discussed: frustration about unfairness, toxic leaders, goals they cannot achieve. So they speak about these things, um, and you can predict a scandal by just looking at how people speak in the organization. So language is a mirror of reality. The way we speak and we act is connected. And if you speak like in a war as a leader, you push your people to the limit. The same if you speak like in a cult, a sect, like Elizabeth Holmes was doing, or the WeWork founder Adam Neumann was doing, or when others call you a messiah because you are this great CEO and messiahs walk over water. If you have this language of we are changing humanity's destiny, Theranos, um, um, that does something to the team. Because if we are the future, if we are humans' transformational power, rules don't count for us, right? We are
Wow.
special. Um, we are God's special company. So language is deforming, is distorting how people perceive what is right and wrong. And it helps us predict that something might go wrong because we can look at the language of leaders. So I always advise leaders, do not talk like in a war, do not talk like in a sect, do not sugarcoat in your euphemistic language bad things, because it will push your people to do bad things.
It's fascinating that I pay a lot of attention to press releases and press secretaries and the thing they have to say. And many years ago, I started to become very aware what is fake news and what is real, and you're so spot on when people start talking about very inspirational language, and I see it in annual reports. I think this is the thing that bothers me is that I I invest in certain stocks and then I read the annual report and I think, no, 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 I am not staying there because some of it is sugar coated and
Mm.
that's while I'm all in favor of being optimistic, but don't sugarcoat it for me. Um, so is there anything specific, anything small that you think people wouldn't normally recognize that is sort of a signal when somebody's really starting to go down that slippery slope? Is there a signal? I mean, I understand what happened at Wells Fargo, and that was a big slippery slope. But, is there something in day to day that you think people would recognize?
You mean from outside or from inside?
Both.
I mean, if you look from outside at the company, you can see the dark pattern very often coming, right? You can see that a CEO is considered toxic. You can see that they formulate goals where investors would say these are totally unrealistic goals.
Yeah,
And you can Google it very often. You can Google harassment cases. You can Google legal violations. I mean, there are companies like Tesla. There is an entire Wikipedia entry on their legal violations. It's thousands of cases.
yeah,
So you can see that there's something wrong with certain corporate cultures from the outside. When you are an investor, when you are someone who is looking for a job, um, and you see these things that should make you cautious. From the inside, it's sometimes very small rule breaking that is tolerated that is a warning signal, right? I had a case of a company that had a big corruption scandal where I was told when I was working with the company that the ringleader of the corruption scheme was smoking in the office, and smoking in the office was not allowed. So he was signaling to everyone else that this rule doesn't count for him. And if that rule doesn't count for him, probably there are other rules that don't count for him. Then there's this other thing. I guess when there is, and that's what my analysis of scandals shows, when there is cases of sexual harassment, I always tell the compliance people dig deeper because
there's
if there
more.
is that kind of behavior, there's also other rule breaking. It's the same people who think rules don't count for them. So there are warning signals. Or another element is the higher turnover rate of female leaders, because female leaders tend not to accept corporate cultures that are too toxic, while men often think, "Well, I have to go through this. One day I will also be a leader, but now it's this for me." So it's always like this. No, women would say, "No, I don't take this anymore. I go somewhere else." So if there's a above the average turnover rate of female leaders, that's a warning signal, or burnout rates, right, in particular teams and departments.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
if you want to see it, you can see it.
It's there. It's let's not ignore it anymore. Let's have a close look.
Right.
Okay, we've talked about the dark patterns and that's all negative stuff. Let's change it over now. Let's talk about the bright patterns. That's the flip side of every dark pattern. There's a bright pattern in place. So, what do you think if someone's going to really turn the switch in an organization, what do you think would be the first, I don't know, two or three bright patterns that should start to change the tide of a culture that's been kind of buried, let's say, up until this point? What do you think the key bright patterns are, the non-negotiables, as it were?
In all these scandals that I have analyzed, and I've analyzed pretty much all the big ones of the last 20 years, there's always at least someone who speaks up, who says what we do is wrong, who writes an email to the CEO or goes to compliance or HR, whatever. And the result is always the same. They get pushed back, they get yelled at, they get threatened, they get kicked out.
Like the whistleblowers.
The whistleblowers, right? And whistleblowers are I always differentiate between whistleblowing and speaking up because a whistleblower is someone who does the last possible thing,
Ah,
going outside, right? So, but we know that whistleblowers normally have tried everything else inside first before they go outside. Take this case of Uber, where there was this female software engineer, and she starts to work for them, and she gets sexually harassed by her boss the first day she works there. She does the right thing. She contacts HR. And HR tells her, yeah, what he did is not right, but he never did this before, and he's a high performer. We can do nothing against him, but we can offer you to change department. She changes department. She gets harassed again. She goes to HR. HR tells her, yeah, never did this before. We cannot do anything. He's a high performer, but you can change departments. She changed a second time. She gets harassed again. She goes to HR, and HR tells her, look, it's the third time now that you come to us. You should ask yourself how you provoke all these things. So you see, and that's when she went public. And that's how the scandal of Uber exploded. So people try first to solve issues inside the organization. But if you don't give them the space, if you don't give them the benign context in which this is possible, they fail. And if others observe around them that it is highly risky to speak up, they won't do it. So to answer your question about the bright pattern, the first thing that a company needs to do is to create context in which it is totally risk-free to speak up about problems. You have companies like Volkswagen or Novartis when they had a scandal, a Swiss pharmaceutical company, where the CEOs would even forbid the word problem. They would argue that if you have a problem, it is a signal of incompetence. So you're fired for having a problem. And if that is the culture, you don't have a problem, right? You hide them.
yeah.
You do whatever it takes not to make them visible. So let people speak up about problems. And that's easier said than done because culture in the end is nothing else but the stories going around. And the stories going around in an organization normally are those of people who spoke up and get punished, right? So if those stories go around, you won't speak up. You need to create two things. You need to create the culture for speaking up, which means you need to train leaders to listen and followers to appropriately speak up, to know how to do this in a way that people listen to them. And you have to create the structural measures to protect them, anti-retaliation systems, so that they speak up and afterwards they are protected against even subtle retaliation, because very often the retaliation comes in a subtle way. If they feel protected, they will do the right thing.
Okay, so an important point you make here, and I think it's one that I've come across several times, being able to speak up. First of all, a leader is going to say, I'm really busy, send me an email, right?
Mhm.
So that's usually problem number one with speaking up. And I believe speak up culture is a really good thing to have. But the second thing is going to be, what about those environments where they say, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions, right? So if you bring a problem, it's going to be about complaining. So you don't want it to be complaints, you want to highlight something, but at the same time, you need somebody to listen because you put it in an
Mhm.
email, you've just, created a chain of things that could ultimately hang you. So how do you deal with that?
First of all, I think this sentence, don't come to me with problems, only with solutions, is super dangerous.
Oh,
Because
sure.
very often people observe something is wrong, but they don't have an answer about how to fix it. So if
Yeah.
you tell me, don't come to me unless you have a solution, I will not come to you, right? So I will remain silent, even though I might not have fear. It's just that I don't have the solution. So, and I was told not to come without a solution. So this, I always tell leaders, do not use that sentence because you disencourage people to come and speak openly. There are several reasons why people don't speak up. The first one we see in the scandal is fear, and I mentioned that.
Mm.
You get punished. The second one is maybe as dangerous. I have this feeling, yeah, my leader is not creating a climate of fear, so I can go with problems to him or her, but then nothing happens afterwards. So it's pointless to go there. That's the second bad thing. The third thing is people observe their own leaders and how they behave. If you don't speak up to your own leader, I don't speak up to you because I understand that you don't like speaking up or that you think it's risky. And if you think it's risky for me too. So you can send all kind of bad signals to your team that
Mhm.
disencourages them from speaking up, even though you want them to speak up. You need to listen without emotions. You need to ask questions. You need to follow up. And you need to thank the person who comes to you and maybe praise that person in front of everyone so that news stories go around about how good it is to speak up in the team, right? So but leaders have to be trained to do this and followers have to be trained to speak up. It's a skill set that you need, right? For instance, if I come to you and speak up, I might present or frame the problem in a way that you feel morally accused. And we
Mhm.
don't like moral identity threats. So if I accuse you morally, you will push back, even though you might not want to, but you push back. It's a knee-jerk reaction. If I frame it as a concern I have that is relevant for you as my leader, it's a very different situation. So just the framing can switch you from pushing back to listening carefully to me. If we train these things, speaking up might happen. If we don't train this, just by telling everyone you can come and speak up, that will not help.
And yet there's so much leadership training out there. I'm sure that encouraging speaking up is a very fundamental part of that
It should.
training. It
It
should.
should, but it normally isn't. I haven't seen it. And the other thing, people speak up in a climate where it is normal to talk about ethics. And this is the second element of the bright pattern in our book, where we say you must, as a leader, constantly engage or regularly engage your team in ethical conversations. And we have to fight against this stereotype that managers have who think that if I talk about ethics, I'm considered a weak leader. People will think I'm weak because I talk about an ethical problem. It's crazy, but this is what makes managers mute, morally mute. And there's research on that is 20, 30 years old. Managers think ethics makes them look weak. But the opposite is, of course, the case. If you talk about ethical issues, your own dilemma situations, or if you just engage the team in a discussion on a scandal you read about in the news and ask, could this happen here? If not, why not? Can we be sure? If you talk about values of the company and how to use them in a particular decision-making situation. So this kind of normalizing of ethical conversations will lead people to speak up more often because they consider it normal. And it's the same, but that we mentioned before. If at Wells Fargo, everyone believes it's normal to cheat on your customer, that's what they do. If they consider it normal to engage in ethical conversations, that's what they do. So you have to create this climate where this is normalized.
Hmm. And interesting. And I'm just going to throw this out. I about 40, I'm going to say 40, maybe 45 years ago, the whole concept of efficiency became a really big area of conversation. It's my personal observation and nothing more. And you know more about some of the history of scandals than I do, I'm sure. Um, but how much do you really think being efficient has contributed to scandals? You know, cut corners, do it faster, bypass this, bypass that. You know, it's all about speed and efficiency. And I think that has been kind of at the center of carving out some of the ethical practices. Because let's face it, to do the right thing at the right time for the right reasons sometimes just does take a little bit longer, right?
Mhm.
So, how much do you think the whole concept of efficiency has contributed to some of these dark patterns?
It's a huge issue, and it links to what I mentioned already when we talked about ideology. Because the key
Um,
value of this ideology that we teach in business schools, that companies put into practice, the neoliberal ideology that came with Friedman and Hayek and the others in the 1950s, has at its core efficiency as the ultimate value. The system must be as efficient as possible. And this was put into practice in companies starting at the time of Jack Welch. And what did Jack Welch do to
Yeah,
increase shareholder value? He fired 25% of the people in 4 years,
yeah.
right? That makes it super efficient because you have extremely reduced costs and you produce more stuff with smaller teams all the time. And at Boeing, they tried the same because these people at Boeing, they had three CEOs in a row who were coming from the team of Jack Welch. They just fired 20%, 25% of the workforce in the first 4 years, including their most expensive and most experienced engineers. But you can squeeze an organization only to a point because sooner or later, quality issues emerge, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
You cannot build, this was the sentence they used at Boeing, to do more with less. Many companies use that in the meanwhile, to do more with less. It's such a dangerous sentence because it only works to a certain point.
Yeah.
But at one point, you cannot do more with it. You cannot build more airplanes with smaller budgets and smaller teams. It's just not possible without risking the quality. And that is what happened, right? So you push people too much with this efficiency thinking, and you think, well, you can sell more products, you can build more airplanes, you can build a cheaper filter, whatever it is, you can do everything more efficient. No, you can't. But if you are in this climate of fear where it's not even possible to say that's too much, we cannot build more airplanes now with this small team. You cannot take away more resources from us and expect
Mm.
more performance. If you cannot say that without being fired, well, then you try, but then you fail as well. So efficiency, I would say, is at the core of a lot of these elements.
Yeah, yeah. The one bright pattern that I really liked, the way you talked about it, and I think it comes from all the work I do in risk management, is the holistic responsibility, because and that goes hand in hand to me with accountability. And this, say a little bit more about that in terms of how do you do that flip from the rigid ideology over to holistic responsibility and everybody taking more accountability? How do you flow that into the culture?
If I start again with ideology, we believe and we teach this in business schools and managers practice it to say, well, markets are a kind of jungle. And to survive, you have to fight all your enemies. Michael Porter's five forces is nothing else but an idea about a company being surrounded by enemies. And you have to fight back because they want something from you. Your customers want something, the government wants something, your employees want something. You have to fight back all the time because you have this one goal, and that is maximizing shareholder value. But you can maximize only one thing. You can never maximize two things. You can only balance several goals, right? But if you maximize, it means at any price. It means that you do whatever it takes for the shareholder. Like Jack Welch did at GE, like they did at Boeing, at Volkswagen, at Theranos, everywhere. You just look for one thing. Holistic means that you understand that good leadership today means to balance many expectations from many stakeholders that are very often contradictory. There's not one primacy of one of them. In order to survive in the long run, you cannot maximize shareholder value. That's the paradox, right? GE was maximizing shareholder value for years under Jack Welch, and Boeing was doing the same under his disciples. Um, but you come to a breaking point sooner or later because you destroy the organization with your maximizing and efficiency type of thinking. Um, you need to balance the various interests that include nature, that include your workers, that include human rights in your supply chains, that include good governance, and that is very different from just maximizing one thing.
So Guido, you've worked around the world. You've been all over Europe, the US, Asia. Is there any one region or any one practice from around the world that you would say, ah, this is a very good example. I would like everybody to know about this. I'm sure.
That's a very, very dangerous question because as you know, many of these companies that ended up in big scandals were praised for being such great companies. I mean, Wells Fargo was winning awards of best
Awards.
employer of the year,
Yeah.
year after year. Volkswagen was the most sustainable company. They were receiving awards for their ethics and compliance program. So I'm very cautious about giving examples of good companies because it can
Well, maybe just
change
a
so quickly.
sector, maybe a sector as opposed to naming a company.
Not even a sector, I would say, because you have scandals all over the place. What I can pick out is examples of companies doing one thing of all these things right. For instance, there's um, Landesbanken, which is one of the biggest banks in Sweden, and they have no incentives, no bonus. They just pay fixed salaries because they think, well, if we start to pay bonuses, um, then customers will be sold products. If we define quota and give bonus, customers will be sold products they don't need. We don't want our salespeople to do that, right? So
Hmm.
you refuse to engage in this game, and there's still a high-performing bank. Mm. We sometimes make this mistake to believe, well, if you don't pay a bonus, then your best people leave. No, the bonus is not changing performance. And there's clear research on that. Give people decent salaries and, and respectful working conditions, and they will perform. But we believe it's just a bonus that you have to give them. So this is one example, or take another example of an American startup, Zappo, and they
Oh,
had
Zappos, yeah.
they had not these unrealistic targets, and they were not punishing people for not achieving goals. They were helping people to work on their individual goals in a way that they would improve. There was no threat connected to not achieving your goals. Right? And then they were bought by Amazon, and then everything changed.
Yeah. Mhm.
So you have examples, but to say there's one company doing all these things right so that you find the bright pattern, that's difficult. Companies that are very good in managing these things are typically companies that had a scandal. So they are in moral shock, so to speak, and some of them clean up in a very good way. Take the case of Novartis that we discussed in the book. So it's a Swiss pharmaceutical company that had a big corruption scandal. And when they cleaned up, they extended the idea of compliance into ethics and psychology. Think, well, we have to understand that our people do wrong things, not because of they're bad, but because of the circumstances they're in. So they analyze circumstances, not just people. And they train them in how to manage dilemma situations. So they have drawn a lesson from their own mess in which they were. But you have to go beyond this purely legalistic understanding of compliance if you want to achieve that.
So let's turn this a little bit up the organization. Governance, right? So we've been talking about the senior leadership and so on, but governance at the board level. Now, this is going to be, usually medium to larger companies that are going to have boards. How much do you attribute shifts from where there was darkness to where there are going to be, looking at bright patterns? How much of that shift do you think can actually be driven through governance practices and the culture at the board?
In all these scandals, you observe a total failure of the board to see these things coming.
I was wanting a
Yeah.
positive message here.
No, I come to that, but you have to start there because you have to wonder why does that happen? Why do boards not see it coming? Take Wells Fargo. The salespeople at Wells Fargo were 4 times better than the salespeople in other banks in the USA. They were selling 4 times more than the others. If I would be sitting on a board at Wells Fargo, I would wonder, how is that possible? We have more or less the same people, more or less the same products, more or less the same kind of processes. How can we be 4 times better than the others? Well, the answer was fraud, right? But if you don't ask that question, you can never find it out. So I think boards that learn from these that want to learn from these cases is boards that understand that they have to ask different set of questions. For instance, when they hire a CEO, they have to figure out by asking the organizations where he or she worked before about the behavior of this person. They don't become a toxic leader when they are hired by you. They might have been like that before. And you can informally figure that out by asking. Um, but boards don't do that. And very often the people in the board have been toxic leaders themselves before they became board members. So they don't see the need for doing that, right? So um, don't hire these CEOs that are toxic. Don't hire these brutal cost cutters who don't care about human dignity. Um, because that might be a success in the short run, but then they destroy the organization. So ask the right questions. Ask about goals, whether they are achievable. Get informed about the incentive structures in the organization. Get involved in the hiring of top leaders and ask who they are and where they come from and look into rules. Why is my organization so often in the news with a legal violation? That is a question you could ask as a board member, right? And what's wrong with how we perceive rules? One of the board members of Volkswagen, after the scandal, said we had developed over the years a culture of rule breaking. Yeah,
Hmm.
why didn't you see that before, right?
Yeah.
Because you don't think about ethics when you're on a board. You think this is not part of your job, and then it happens. Um, that's one thing. So asking the right question. The other thing is boards have committees. Why don't you have a committee for ethics and compliance? Very few do. Very few boards speak with the chief compliance officer. Why not? So create the structures and understand what questions you have to ask to realize what culture the organization has and what kind of human risks might be building up in the organization.
Yeah. Yeah. The um, the last thing I'd like to go with is let's inspire our listeners to make some changes, to apply some of the positive messages that are in your book, because I think there are so many. And what is the one habit, the one bright pattern? And I know we've talked about the moral conversations being really important and holistic responsibility, moral clarity, and so on. But from a behavior standpoint, what would be the one thing you would really want to see change as the sign that we're now going to apply what we've learned? What would be that one thing you'd want to be looking for?
Well, you can look at this as we did from the perspective of the organization, where I would again say you must, as a leader, normalize ethical conversations, create speak up culture, and help people to support each other. But there's this other dimension where you could ask yourself, how can I protect myself against the dark pattern? As a
Mm,
leader, as a team member, what can I do? And there's one thing that sticks out if you look at what people say afterwards when they were caught doing the wrong thing, how they justify what they did. And one of the things they used to say is, I thought I had no choice. I thought I had no choice. What I highly recommend leaders when I do trainings in companies or my students at university is you always need a plan B in life. You always have to be ready to say, if that one job that I have right now, this one career, this one bonus, this one whatever is going away, um, I have something else. I have a plan B. I can go and do something else. Because if you depend too much on this organization, this career, this job, this bonus, you will do whatever it takes, if necessary, to keep it. And that makes you vulnerable to all kind of moral and legal issues. So it's so liberating to have a plan B. If my university fires me tomorrow, it would not be nice, but I have 3, 4, 5 ideas of what to do next. And that is liberating because it gives you the power to say no when the moment comes where you should say no.
yeah. I like what you said about there's a choice when I teach risk management, and there's invariably a whole compliance element in there. I always say to students, the choice to be compliant is yours. It's a choice in the moment. You choose not to comply or you choose to comply. the slippery slope starts with your decision not to comply. And that's
Yes.
very expensive for organizations. And um, the sections in the book where you talk about the slippery slope. I think if there's one takeaway for our listeners today is I would encourage everybody to start looking across the organization and see whether you've got some kind of slippery slope going on. Because to me that really struck home.
Yes.
Excuse me about that. Guido, any last words that you'd like to finish with?
I think we all need to humbly accept that it could happen to us. We think of us as good people. And we look at scandals and think this would never happen to me. But that's what they thought as well until it happened. So let's be humble and know it could happen to us. And that's the foundation for protecting ourselves against the dark pattern.
Yeah, have the will to do the right thing. Wonderful. Thank you. This has been a fabulous conversation, and I really look forward to publishing this very, very quickly and sharing it with the audience here as well as all my mailing audience. They will be getting a link to this. Thank you so much, and I wish you a good evening.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Absolutely.